Okay, we should be live.
Assalamu alaikum, everyone. So, inshallah, we'll be starting in 2 more minutes. We'll wait for more people to come in. So, we'll shoot for 7:10. Okay, so assalamu alaikum everyone. We will be starting now. So jazakumullah khairan for attending our very first session in our series tackling anti-Blackness in our society, community, and self. This is the first session and it's in partnership with Believers Bailout, and it will be given by Sister Nabiha. Nabiha is a civil rights attorney and an organizer with Believers Bailout, so she will be giving a talk for about an hour. So inshallah, we'll have 30 minutes at the end for a Q&A session. And so we ask for you to please save your questions for the Q&A portion. And right before the Q&A portion, we will be giving more guidelines about that session and how it will be conducted. So now I will pass on the mic to Nabiha to take over.
Assalamu alaikum. Maha, thank you so much for that kind introduction. Thank you also to the Islamic Center for inviting me back. I think some folks might know that I lived in Columbia for quite a while. I'm a graduate from the University of Missouri. I got my degrees in political science and biology. I also did my master's of public health there. I was also quite active during my time in Columbia. So it's wonderful to be back, even if it's not in person. I'm really excited again to be invited. My day job is working as a civil rights attorney. I do federal litigation. And with all of my free time, I organize with a group called Believers Bailout. Believers Bailout is a collective of abolitionists that are Muslim who are based in Chicago. We're based in Chicago, although we do work all over the country, primarily by paying people's immigration and pretrial incarceration bonds, which we'll talk about a little bit today. I'll also talk about some of our anchoring values and the ways that we see Islam intersect with the work that we do around the criminal legal system, and ultimately with trying to do away with the criminal legal system as it exists. I'm going to do a really quick sound check for folks who are in the chat box. Is my volume okay with you all?
There was one comment that said to speak a little louder. So I don't know. Oh, and then we have a thumbs up. So maybe just a little bit.
Oh, I will do my best to project.
Yeah. It's fine. So.
But I'm also sitting in my kitchen, so it will feel a little awkward for me. That being said, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and, oh boy. Well, let's try it. Okay, I think my screen is being appropriately shared. I'll wait for Maha to give me a thumbs up in her screen, if so. Thank you so much. Okay, so Believers Bailout, we often start with this ayat. And do you realize what is this deep road? It is freeing of a human being from bondage. Believers Bailout is an organization, like I said, that was started in 2018 by a group of women Muslim academics. The thought behind it was that people were doing these things called the Mama's Day Bailout. People were going to Cook County jails and other jails around the country and paying bail for those who were incarcerated pre-trial, which means they were only sitting in jail because they did not have the ability to financially afford whatever bond was placed on them. So if they were charged with a crime, they weren't yet convicted of a crime, and yet only because they didn't have the money, they were being incarcerated by the state. Inspired by Mama's Day Bailout, in which people went on Mother's Day to pay people's bail so that mothers could be at home with their families on Mother's Day, BBO started. And we thought, what is the role of Muslims in this conversation and in this movement? If there's something unjust about someone sitting in a cage on days where you should be with family and community, then surely there's something Islam has to say about it, or teaches us that we should be some kind of action we should be taking. So Believers Bailout operates with three core principles on what we're trying to tackle. We're tackling anti-Muslim racism, we're tackling anti-Black racism, and we're tackling the prison industrial complex. So I'm going to go one by one. Anti-Muslim racism is a set of treatment, structures, systems that are erected to enforce discriminatory treatment towards people who affiliate as Muslims. We call this anti-Muslim racism as opposed to something like Islamophobia, because oftentimes, in most instances, the kinds of discrimination Muslims are treated with is racialized. So it's also a question of who is perceived as Muslim, and rather than how you might yourself feel about your own faith. So oftentimes we'll see a large swath of people who are perceived as Muslims that might be groups of South Asians or Sikhs, and they'll also experience the effects of anti-Muslim racism. Anti-Muslim racism also informs a lot of the policies that our own government takes, and the Muslim ban is, a primary example, but we're also talking about other examples that aren't as flashy or aren't as prominent. The second core principle that we have in terms of what we're trying to tackle is anti-Black racism. You'll note that I'm not saying racism. We're being very specific here for a reason. We acknowledge that racism does exist, but one of the foundational discriminatory treatments towards all people is founded on anti-Black racism. White supremacy creates a notion that there's a racial hierarchy and that whites are at the top, and then there could be a whole slew of types of people in between that, and that Black people are at the bottom. And so anti-Black racism is extremely important to tackle because, one, it's foundational to the types of discrimination that every other person faces. Second, it's a moral obligation that we address what's happening to the most marginalized people in our society. If something is happening that's specific to people who aren't you, that doesn't mean you don't have a step in taking to address it. We believe that anti-Black racism informs so much of how the prison industrial complex operates. We'll be talking throughout the rest of this presentation about the various ways in which the structure of policing and the criminal punishment system and jails and prisons functions as an effect of American slavery, in which Black people were enslaved. The third topic that we'll be touching upon, which is also one of our core principles, is tackling the prison industrial complex. When I say prison industrial complex, again, that refers more than just prisons. It's not just bail, it's not just jails. It's talking about prosecutors, it's talking about dungeon economies, it's talking about all the ways that we have a system that's set up for people to make money and somewhat benefit off of the caging, the policing, and the surveillance of other human beings. And so in order to effectively address the prison industrial complex, we have to think about the entire system as it exists and not just one chunk of it, because they are all interrelated. Okay, so I've talked a little bit about money bail, but now I'm going to talk a lot more about it in the specifics. Here's a pretty large infographic, but we're going to break it down. Money bail. Money bail is the system by which you are incarcerated unless you can pay money to get out. This is an infographic that was made by those folks at Believers Bailout. Shout out to my very lovely collaborators. So basically, it's a system that operates in certain jurisdictions around the United States, in which someone is arrested based on something called probable cause, which is a legal standard. And it just says that someone can allege that there's probable cause that you may have committed a crime. You're then arrested and then taken to jail. However, even in this, Black people are twice as likely to be held in jails pre-trial. So you can get booked, which means you're taken to a police station, they start to process you, fingerprints are taken, they collect your personal information, and either you can be released without bail, you can just walk away, or you're released, or you're told, we don't trust you to go out based on what happened. You have to pay us effectively a ransom in order to be released back into your own home. Again, this is a racially biased system. Black people are 2.5 times more likely to be arrested in the first place. And then after they're booked, they're twice as likely to be held pre-trial for the same crime. What does that mean for people? Okay, Well, for those who can pay bail, say you're held on bail and you have the money, you can go home, you can get your defense counsel, you can start defending yourself, you can return to your life, you can get back to your job, can take care of your kids. If you can't pay bail, you have to go through either sit in that jail until whenever the time of your court date is determined, um, which could be days, weeks, months. Again, having never actually been convicted of a crime. Or you can go to someone called a commercial bail bondsman. This is someone you pay them a portion of your bail, and then they will front the rest of the money to the courts. But then when your case resolves, that bail, which should be returning back to the person who paid it, actually goes to the bail bondsman. So this is a way off of which people have figured out how to make a profit off of a system that incarcerates people. And again, say you're stuck in this prison, the effects of remaining in jail include psychological trauma. You could lose your house, you can lose your job, you can lose custody of your children. We're going to talk a little bit about the ways that people of faith are denied their ability to practice in prisons. And especially when we're thinking about what's happening with COVID right now, sitting in a jail because you don't have the money to get out could possibly mean sickness, if not death. That doesn't sound like a system that makes a lot of sense to me, nor does it to Believers Bailout. So there's a system of, there's a series of groups that have community bail funds. So it's a way of trying to address this problem by saying, we don't want to go to a commercial bondsman, and we don't think bail is just or fair, and we need to find a way to pool our resources to get our people free. And so as a result, there's a lot of community bail funds that have been popping up in the last several years. The Chicago Community Bond Fund is one of the largest ones in the country and are one of our initiating partners. They take the funds in, and when people make requests that they can't pay bail, the Chicago Community Bond Fund will give them that money. And then on top of it, do the things to do whatever it takes to make sure that the person is successful when they get released. So that means showing up to trials and court hearings, making sure that we can coordinate support for them, providing sometimes assistance in sitting in court. I started working with community bond funds, actually with the Chicago Community Bond Fund. And I was paired with people who had been charged with a crime and had to drive miles and miles to get to the courthouse to sit before in a court waiting for their time to be called have a very quick check-in with the judge. And it's a very scary and very lonely experience. People are, you can't bring a phone in, you're kind of just sitting there waiting to see what's going to happen. And so bail funds go beyond just paying bail. They also seek to provide support to people so that they know that there's a community around them that supports them as they fight their charges. So let's talk about the prison industrial complex. Where are people locked up in the United States? So a lot of times people will talk about what's happening in federal prisons, but you'll see that the majority of people are actually being held in state prisons. There's over, this is over 1 million people are just being held in state prisons. That's something that each state determines that they're going to incarcerate people over. If you zoom in, you can see that there's different kinds of charges. Some of them are public order, some of them are drugs, property, and violence, quote unquote, violent offenses. You'll see another large chunk are people who are sitting in local jails. Again, local jails are places that people sit where they have not yet been convicted, but they're just based on this chart, there's over 500,000 people sitting in these jails waiting for their day in court. You'll also see here, there's a section about immigration detention, 61,000 people. So that prompts me to say that starting in our second year, Believers Bailout ventured out and started to also pay immigration incarceration. You'll note I'm also calling all of these incarceration. You're not detained if you're sitting in a prison or you're sitting in a jail or you're sitting in an immigration context. You're incarcerated. You are being caged by the state, and detention puts this gloss on the word as if it's something lighter than it actually is. Immigration incarceration is, again, a carceral system that's established by ICE, which is Immigration and Customs Enforcement, I believe. And what they do, again, is they say that you've broken the law by some kind of violation of immigration law. And then they make you sit in an immigration cage. We've all seen the pictures of families sitting at the cages on the border, families that are separated, children that are separated from their families. That's all part of immigration incarceration. And the difference between that and pretrial incarceration is immigration incarceration is run by federal entities that put in astronomically high bonds so that people are not able to walk away from and be able to go back to their communities and have their court date in immigration court until they pay fees that are $15, $20, $25, $50,000. Those kinds of fees just completely dry a community's resources up because it's not only an individual that's affected by any of these systems. It is families, it is partners, it is entire communities that have to fundraise because oftentimes in both any form of incarceration, if you don't pay it, the consequence might be death. It's for people who have never been convicted of a crime or being sentenced to death by the state. For many people who are sitting in immigration incarceration, if they aren't able to pay their immigration bond of something like $50,000, they're threatened with deportation, which for many people is a life or death issue. Again, this system doesn't have to exist the way it does. If anything, it's accelerated over the course of the many administrations we've had and over the course of time. But before we get into what it looks like today, I think we need to talk a little bit about how it started. So I keep talking about police the same way I'm talking about jails and prisons. And one thing that I think is really important to draw out is that there's a direct historical connection between the way that modern day police departments function and how they operate and how they exist. And it links directly back to slave patrols. So I talked about it before. Slavery is the progenitor of our entire system that we have in the carceral system. Slaves were human beings who were ripped of their freedom, oftentimes of their religion. We know up to 1/3 of African enslaved people were Muslim, and they were not permitted to practice their religion, keep their name, maintain their culture under penalty of abuse and death. They were seen as property. And as a result of that, there were slave patrols that were effectively set up to catch what they saw as property that had gotten lost. Slaves are human beings who are trying to run to each other, free themselves, get to a place of safety. And slave patrols were effectively police officers who were trying to confiscate loose property and return it to its owner, a human being back to another human being. I know that for some people it's very shocking to hear this analogy, but it's not just an analogy, it's something that's embedded in our legal system. Because after the abolition of slavery, there was an entirely new section of federal law that was passed. It's called Section 1983 of the Civil Rights Act. And that said that the people who had previously been agents of the state, such as police officers and public officials and governmental representatives, were no longer immune from being sued. It effectively set up a process by which, if you were someone who was harmed by a government agent, you could sue them under Section 1983. And it was supposed to be a way of trying to address the harms that slavery had had on now the newly slaved Black people who are in the South and trying to create a life after being ripped of everything for generations. In response to that, courts developed on their own this idea that's called qualified immunity. Qualified immunity says, oh, well, in some instances, government officials should remain immune or like they shouldn't be allowed to be sued because what they do is so important that if they got sued, they wouldn't be allowed to continue to do it. And qualified immunity is still a legal concept that I, in my day job, among other people, still grapple with. It says that police officers what they're doing is so important that they shouldn't be sued no matter what they're doing unless it's incredibly egregious. So oftentimes what you'll see is that people who are murdered by the police Those police officers don't face consequences, prosecution, lawsuits by the state because of qualified immunity. They legally cannot be held accountable. So I think that creates a problem. For some people, they say that what we should do is get rid of qualified immunity. We should sue all these police officers. That's one solution. But I'm going to ask for the folks who are listening in to try to dig a little deeper and ask, what is it that we really want? Is what we want the ability to sue a police officer and maybe sentence them to another criminal sentencing after they've already murdered someone? Or is what we want that the murder didn't happen in the first place? Is what we want that the harm could not have existed? So now you hear a lot of people talk about this concept of defunding the police. And that's not just a slogan. That's something that's based in writings that have been around for 50 plus years that are pioneered by Black women who are abolitionists who say, we're trying to get into a better world, and a better world means that we should be in a place where the harm didn't occur in the first place. And in order to get there, oppressive structures and systems like the police and jails and prisons shouldn't be there because they only inflict more harm. We need to think about ways that we get a world in which that harm could not exist. I'm going to keep talking about slavery. Prisons, again, are a direct descendant of the slave system. So much so that there's a Louisiana state penitentiary that is dubbed, quote, Angola, based on the African country of Angola, because it was an African country from which slaves came. And this prison maintains the same, almost entirely same Black population of incarcerated people today that go on to do things like free prison labor. So I think some folks may have seen Ava DuVernay's documentary called 13th, which is about the 13th Amendment, which abolished indentured servitude such as slavery, except for instances of the prison industrial complex, which means basically we can't make you do slave labor unless you're in a prison. And that's exactly what's happening at prisons across the country. So many of our products are created through slave labor. That's our clothes, that's industrial items, that's a whole level of manufacturing. And these prisoners are paid pennies for their labor per hour. And then those goods are sold back to us as the American public. So again, when we talk about prisons and policing and prosecution and the criminal legal system, the question we have to ask ourselves is, who's ultimately profiting from it? And in the instance of prison labor, it's large corporations that are using the cheap labor, slave labor, in order to make goods and then sell them back to us. So what does this have to do with Muslims? I know that's something that people are interested in. So first of all, before we even get there, I think we need to acknowledge that a plurality of the American community of Muslims are Black people. Black Muslims are upwards of 35% of the American community. They have been here since their enslaved ancestors were here. They started the civil rights movements that we are all grateful for. They started our masajid before we had the immigrant wave of people who are allowed to come in following the erasure of the Chinese Exclusionary Act. Black Muslims are part of not only American fabric, but of our communities and our Muslim communities. And yet we tend to separate how we think about Black people and Muslims as if they're separate communities, as opposed to Black Muslims being the foundation of ours. That being said, Muslims are not immune to any of these issues. There was a report that was issued by the civil rights organization Muslim Advocates, disclaimer, I work there, by my former legal fellow, Yusuf Sai, where he did Freedom of Information Act requests across every state and aggregated the information. And he found in this one-of-a-kind study that's no one's done before, that in state prisons, Muslims are overrepresented. This is particularly so in Pennsylvania, Maryland, New Jersey, DC, and likely in California, but we couldn't even get those records. Muslims are up to 20% of the population in these states, despite being only 1% of the national population. Talking about prisons and the carceral system is directly linked to our issues as a Muslim community. Second, Muslims, when they're incarcerated, are often denied the ability to practice their religion. That means not getting halal food. That means not getting to practice Ramadan. That means not going to Jummah. That means not being given praying mats. There's hundreds and hundreds of lawsuits that have been filed specifically by Muslim prisoners saying, just because I'm incarcerated doesn't give the United States or the state the right to take away my ability to practice my faith. There's actually an entire federal statute about it called the Religious Land Use and Institutionalized Persons Act that says that the state may not deny people's ability to practice unless they have a compelling interest. And oftentimes, there's no compelling interest to deny people the ability to have their suhoor or to be able to have iftar. Some states specifically downplay incarcerated Muslims' basic religious needs. They'll make Muslim prisoners do things like submit written requests or get a Christian chaplain to sign off on requests. It's basically up to whatever prison that a Muslim is incarcerated in as to whether or not they'll be able to practice their faith while they're incarcerated. And then finally, that prison population of Muslims continues to grow. And another thing that this report revealed was that actually Muslim women are deeply affected and, again, overrepresented by these carceral systems, specifically in state prisons. So when we're talking about how does a prison industrial complex affect our community, let's not forget about the women. Women are also brutalized and caged by the same systems that we're talking about. So let's talk about Missouri. 51,000 people in Missouri are being caged by the state today. 32,000 people are in state prisons. That means it's up to the state government as to whether or not they're being incarcerated. 11,000 are in jails. Again, jails are where people are held before they've even been convicted of a crime. There's about 1,000 kids who are sitting in quote unquote correctional facilities, but they're incarcerated. And then another 6,700 in federal incarceration. That number keeps going up. So again, we're talking about the prison industrial complex. We have to think about who's profiting and why the system remains as it is. It's, again, not a system that benefits us. And I said, quote unquote, correctional, because when you think about prisons, they don't serve as a place where people have the resources to do better or get better. They're places where people are sat in cages until the state determines that they're ready to be released. But at the same time, they're exposed to violence, they're denied their religious rights. And look at this number as it increases. In the 1970s, it was only 150 people incarcerated per 100,000. That number, especially in prisons, has exponentially increased. It leveled off with some federal sentencing guidelines, but I mean, we've been looking at curves for a while. This is not a great trajectory. And it doesn't have to be like this. Another thing, again, the population of people who are incarcerated is informed by the racist systems that we have. So white people, again, are half as likely to be arrested for doing the same crime as other demographics. And as a result, they're underrepresented in prisons. If we incarcerated all people at the same rates at which they were actually committing quote unquote crimes, this number would be much higher. But because people like police officers and prosecutors have discretion as to who they will charge and arrest and go after, we'll see that white people who have, again, historically benefited from white supremacy, access to resources, privileges, implicit benefits, also benefit in this way, where they're seen as innocent and are more likely to let go, even if they've done the same crime as any other demographic. Meanwhile, the exact reverse of that plays out for Black people, where they're criminalized from birth, and they're policed, and then they don't get a chance to even see through their innocence. So I've been talking a lot about the effects that jail has on people. So jail is a place that you sit until you get your trial. But if you're sitting in a cage, it's very difficult to, one, get the defense counsel that you need, particularly if you're already impoverished. And two, the effect of it is that rather than having to sit in a cage for months and months and months in a jail waiting for your court date, some people decide they would rather take a plea They would rather take a plea and just say that they're guilty of whatever they're being charged for, have that time that they've already sat in a cage count towards whatever prison sentence they're given, and then serve the rest of their time in prison. Again, as someone who's worked with people who've been charged with crimes, I've seen that people often don't get their quote unquote day in court. They don't get an opportunity to defend themselves, and rather they are at the time that they're incarcerated pre-trial becomes the incarceration that just transitions into prison. And so they get a conviction without having the right or the presumption of innocence. Again, this is what we call dungeon economies. Prison carceral systems create a system in which someone's making money off of who's incarcerated. So there's the judicial system. Think about the costs that go into being even arrested. It's very expensive to be poor. So if you're charged with a crime, you need an attorney. You also need to pay court fees. You also need to buy a suit. You need to travel to your court dates. If you're incarcerated, you have to pay for a commissary. You have to pay to mail and call your family. All of these things add up, and someone's making money off of it. And so there's an enormous amount of profit to be made off of caging people. That includes the private corporations that build prisons. That's the prison guards who collect a salary and a pension from being the guards at these facilities. That's healthcare. That's the cost of people who want to prosecute people in the legal system. And it's also policing. Policing is a $63 billion, and in some cases, the numbers I've seen, it's over $100 billion investment that the state makes every year. And in a time when there's a moment of a national global pandemic, it doesn't make sense that we're investing $100 billion on a force that's only meant to cage people and put them in prisons. You have to ask, what purpose are the police really serving? I'm going to check if the volume works on this and play a short clip about Believers Bailout. Let me know if it works.
Money bail targets poor people of color, takes away their freedom, and jeopardizes their families, communities, and lives. This Ramadan, pay a zakat to bail out believers and join the movement to end mass incarceration. The American criminal justice system holds over 2 million people. Of those, nearly 500,000 have not been convicted of a crime, but because they cannot afford to pay money bail, they are incarcerated in what is called pre-trial detention, or they are put on electronic monitoring. This money bail system perpetuates an endless cycle of poverty and jail time for some of our nation's poorest people. While the criminal legal system proclaims the principle of innocent until proven guilty, predominantly Black and Latinx people are being incarcerated for days, months, and even years for being poor. Believers Bailout considers pre-trial detention a form of bondage. We are raising zakat-eligible funds to bail Muslims out so that they can address the charges against them while living their lives, caring for their families, and being part of their communities. We are restoring the presumption of innocence. It is in our capacity and our duty as Muslims to be a part of ending this unjust money bail system. Join us this Ramadan on the steeper of two roads.
Time waits for no man, all men seeking better days, retrograde, holding yesterday with both hands.
Okay, thank you. So now we can talk a little bit about Believers Bailout and what we do. So Believers Bailout, like I said, operates as a community bond fund but our specific concern is about Muslims for all the reasons that I talked about today. Muslims face a lot of anti-Muslim racism when they're incarcerated. The incarceration system is based on an anti-Black foundation that continues to attack and is violent to Black people, and that's our communal responsibility to respond to. And it's our method of trying to address the prison industrial complex because we believe it's an obligation as people of faith to liberate one another. So the first step we saw is that we fundraise. Our money is zakat eligible. Our definition of zakat we fill in different ways. So it's people who are needy, people who, like that video said, are in bondage, which is oftentimes in the life of the times of the Prophet, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and people who are enslaved. And for us, if you're sitting in a jail and doing jail labor for no other reason that you can't pay, then we consider that a form of enslavement. We also believe that we qualify, we give zakats for other things, particularly for people who are leaning towards Islam. And then in the case of immigration incarceration, that's someone that we see as a traveler that is on our onus is to support. We've also had our zakats eligibility confirmed by scholars at LaunchGood. We've also worked with a number of different Islamic scholars to help make sure that everything that we do as an imana, as a trust from the community, is done correctly. My role, all of our roles that we do to help administer these funds and do the work is completely volunteer. We rely entirely on the time and the passion of the people who come and work together as a collaborative for Believers Bailout. So we have the funds. We had a really successful first year of Ramadan. It was wonderful to see the support from the community for what we thought were our forgotten siblings who are locked away in cages. And then we make connections with people who are sitting in these cages, and families will reach out to us every day and talk to us about their case. We'll do an intake. And if they meet our criteria where they're eligible for bond and they're Muslim and they're really being harmed by their incarceration, we front the money and then continue to support them. So for post-bond, we work with the person who's incarcerated, and we do all of those things that I talked about. We make sure that they have someone seeing them when they're released. We try to give them some small gift like a Quran and a prayer rug, some dates, something nice to greet them, to let them know that their community on the outside was waiting for them and is so glad to have them back with us. And then we support them for the course of their case. So we go to court with them, we sit with them, we make sure we try to link them with other resources and counseling. To the extent that's possible, we want to be in community with people. We don't see this as a practice of charity. This is an obligation upon our community that we're trying to meet. And so we act as in solidarity with our siblings who are being penalized by this punishment system. The other thing that I'll note is that Believers Bailout is an abolitionist system, or collective. So we're not trying to just pay everyone's bail every time someone requests, because first of all, we don't have the billions of dollars that would require. Rather, we're trying to reduce the harm that's being experienced by people as they sit in these cages. And when I say harm reduction, that means, again, people losing their jobs, their family, their custody, their health insurance, if they're sitting away. But our broader mission is to abolish the system as it exists. And I say system, I mean the bail system. There's a lot of jurisdictions in which bail doesn't exist, and there's no harm that comes to the community. People show up to their court dates, they're able to take care of themselves. All the data bears out that it's as successful, if not more successful, in making sure that people are compliant with court orders than if bail does exist. So again, we have to ask, why does bail exist? But beyond that, Believers Bailout is dedicated to a system, to an analysis that asks, why do prisons exist? Why do jails exist? Is this a solution to our problems that we're asking for? And we try to take a framework that's based in Islam to ask, is this something that would have existed? Is this a sunnah to incarcerate people for days on end, for lifetimes, in brutal conditions? And we believe that a more transformative form of justice is something that Islam calls us to. This was our third annual campaign. Alhamdulillah, we raised so much money. And when I talk about the money, is very abstract, but the stories of who gets out is really touching. There was one instance in which we had a very high bail request for someone who was held in immigration incarceration. And it was a brother from Mauritania. And it was heartbreaking to see what the request was, is that they were in the US because they were trying to escape actual enslavement in Mauritania. They were enslaved today and had escaped to the US and then were sent back into an immigration cage. And because we had the funds on hand, we were able to release them so that they could go free in the US, let alone ever. This is an older chart. It's just a little bit about what we've done. These numbers are much higher. We've now freed dozens of people from pretrial incarceration, both in Cook County Jail in Chicago. We've worked with people in Rikers Island. We've worked with the National Bail Fund Network to help release people in immigration incarceration across the country. And we're doing a lot more. In Ramadan, we raised, in 2019, I don't even have the 2020 numbers up. We also did work to support our sisters that were still incarcerated. So for Eid, we delivered toiletry kits so that the sisters who are incarcerated would have an opportunity to be able to celebrate Eid with dignity and with fresh supplies and be able to partake in our community in that. We add money to the accounts of people, of Muslims in jail so that they can communicate with their families. We also work to distribute supplies to people who are released from jail. So during this Ramadan, during coronavirus, a huge host of volunteers based out of Chicago delivered food and meals to families who are many of these believers who had been bailed out, or the families of believers who are still incarcerated. We've done a number of speaking engagements. On May 1st, we did a full 12-hour live webinar with a huge host of individuals from across the country, Muslims who are working on different elements of liberation and justice, folks from New York, immigration advocates, community organizers. It's all on our YouTube channel, and it's chunked out into different segments. We've also done webinars where we've talked to people like Sheikh, actually Ubaydullah Evans, talking about things like Islamic perspectives on abolition. What does Islam have to say, or what do we as Muslims have to do with abolition? And so all of that is online. We have a ton of resources up. So we're actually doing a pause on presentations, but because this was for Columbia, I made an exception because I still consider this to be my community as well. This is one of the flyers that we had for our toiletry campaign, trying to raise money and get supplies for people who had been incarcerated, and for women specifically, because women experience a gendered form of violence at the very base. Necessities like are taken away from them. Women oftentimes don't have enough, if they want to wear hijab, those aren't supplied to them. And then Sheikh Rami Nassour at the Taiba Foundation often says it's such a dehumanizing system that they'll incarcerate you and then make you pay for the toothpaste to brush your own teeth. And now I'm going to just talk for a very brief bit about what I mean about abolition and why you haven't heard me say the phrase reform. First of all, I'm not calling it a criminal justice system. That would imply something about it is just. It's a legal system that enforces criminal laws that is inherently unjust and has anti-Black racism at its root. The other thing is we talk about abolition, and abolition isn't about taking small incremental steps to get to the goal that you want. Abolition is about calling for a world and building that world where you have the things that you want, rather than trying to take these tiny little steps to get us where we are. The reason I make this distinction specifically is because even our prisons today, the way that they exist, they came as a result of a reform. They were a reform that was based to try to be more humane. So previously, people who are charged with crimes would be executed. And so a lot of Puritans in America, instead, as a more humane reform, said, okay, let's just leave people in these prisons or cages until they've learned their lesson. And what that spawned is a system where millions of people across the country are being incarcerated as a result of this reform. And so we're not asking for reforms anymore because we know that that just reinstitutes the system that we have today. We ask for abolition, and we demand it because we should have a world that is safe and true and values all of us, rather than one in which we're isolated from each other. There's a Muslim abolitionist who has written and worked for decades on these exact topics. Her name is Mariam Kaba. You can follow her on Twitter at Prison Culture. She has a ton of popular education tools like this comic that help talk about what it is that abolitionists are trying to accomplish and what we should do to get there. So in this comic, she says that people oftentimes think abolitionists want a world in which all the police and all the prisons, poof, vanish and disappear tomorrow. And that would be great, but it's not about just what we're taking away. It's about what we're building instead. So I keep asking, what is the need that we're trying to meet when we dispatch a police officer? Is that police officer responding to a mental health need? Why isn't that being met with the mental health resources? Is that police officer responding to a domestic violence event? Why is interpersonal and gendered violence happening that a police has to be dispatched? And what is the actual solution to that doesn't involve one of those people being incarcerated? Is there these poverty crimes, like someone who's loitering because they don't have housing? Why are they being arrested instead of being given housing? So when we talk about abolition, we're saying, what is it that we want that would actually keep us safe and whole and healthy? And the other thing that's really great about this comic, I recommend you all check it out. You can literally type like Mariam Kaba comic or prison culture comic into Google, is that prisons aren't permanent. Prisons are a new development. They've only existed for the last 100+ years. And just as if we've had things that have vanished in that time, we don't think that prisons are inevitable, and it's on us to try to dismantle them and create something better instead. So again, I'll leave it with this notion that we're not asking for things to be torn down, we're asking for something else to be built up. And just to return to this concept of defund the police, we're saying defund the police because they harm us, but also they suck $100 billion out of our pockets. That's taxpayer money. And if we're going to spend $100 billion on something, it should be on something that actually helps us as individuals and as community members. What would $100 billion look like if we put it anywhere else? If we put that into schools or to after school programs or directly into people's pockets when they're suffering and they're in economic distress during COVID. So we're asking for a presence and we're demanding a presence, and we have to be present for one another rather than the system we have where we're caged away from one another, we're invisibilized from one another, and we're disconnected from one another. You can follow all of this stuff. I'm not saying honestly, I'm saying nothing new. All of this has been written about, talked about. I am following the instructions that I've had from the fantastic people, the coordinators at Believers Bailout, who have been at the forefront of this thinking, abolitionists who have been writing about this for decades. You can find out more. Our social media accounts are constantly posting new information. We're on Twitter at Believer Bailout and Instagram at Believers Bailout, and online you can find us at believersbailout.com. We send out newsletters giving people updates about what we're working on, and it's a great place to get connected, especially if you want to figure out other ways to get involved in this or any other initiative that we have going on. All right, and with that, I will stop sharing my screen.
Okay. Jazakallah khairan, Sister Nabiha. That was a really amazing talk, very beneficial. I learned a lot myself. Inshallah, everyone here learned a lot. So now we will be moving on to the Q&A portion. So we will be turning off the YouTube live stream so everyone's comfortable in asking their questions. So we will have 30 minutes and we want to respect everyone's time as well as our speakers. So we want everyone to limit their questions to only 30